Good morning, everybody. It is great to have you on what is a slightly cooler morning, at least here in Southern Ontario. A welcome cooler morning. Hope everybody is doing well and that things are looking good wherever you happen to be in the country. It's great to have, we've got John Saliga, Albert Tenuta, who are going to walk us through tar spot, obviously a subject that is going to have mixed experience for a lot of people. I know for me, I happen to actually be in John's territory. Tar spot is something we have talked about for a few years. We have dealt with, we have sprayed for, we have done all of those types of things, but we're still learning a lot about what we should be doing and timing and all of that. So I'm looking forward to the input there. And I know there's lots on the call with addresses that maybe haven't seen it, but I think are in that boat that we were a couple of years ago that says, it's there, it's coming, you're going to have to deal with it. How do we get prepared to do that? So I think it's going to be a really great hour we've got planned. What I want to just highlight for everybody on the call is that across the top, if you haven't used Teams a whole lot, across the top is the chat section. The chat section is the one that if you have questions as we go out, I'd love if you do that and type it and type in your questions. Right now, it looks like this is maybe something that there's a setting to do so that we can type in it. It shows up right now that it's only available during the meeting. So if there's a way to flip that on, then we can absolutely make sure that you can type in your question, and then I'll interrupt, and John and Albert are going to keep an eye on the chat too, and between the three of us we'll be able to do that. Oh, Albert's got his good morning. Perfect. It's working. So by all means, ask your questions in there, but I am not going to let this go any longer without the introduction for Albert Tenuta, plant pathologist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness now, and John Saliga, area agronomist in the Lambton, Middlesex area. Gentlemen, good morning. The floor is yours.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So looking forward to this opportunity here. Thank you very much for Koteva and John and others and Andrew as well for updating tar spot and giving us an opportunity to plan for what's going on right now, as well as talk about what we can expect in 2025, as well as what we've learned, right? And so John and I are going to take you through a series of different slides in that, and please feel free to jump in as you want and ask questions, as Andrew said as well. So when it comes to tar spot, it's gained a lot of attention since 2021 when we first found it, but it is one of the diseases. But there are other diseases that continue to be an issue in Ontario. Northern corn leaf blight, gibberella ear rot, and particularly dawn continue to drive a lot of our disease pressure in Ontario, as well as other areas of Canada. Gray leaf spot a little less, and you can see tar spot has now become our number one both in Ontario, and depending on the U.S., the year in that it ranks differently as well. And we continue to see that now into last year in 2024, where tar spot, northern corn leaf blight, nematodes are ones that we continue to see an impact and lose some yield to it. And that's an area that we need to increase awareness when it comes to corn. Gibberella and dawn continues to fluctuate depending on the environmental conditions, as we've seen in 2028. And for those that have seen tar spot or haven't seen tar spot, it's a pretty easy disease in terms of identification. It's very similar to what you would see on, say, your maple trees, your ornamentals around the farm, around the house, and that where you have these tar spot type lesions that occur on the leaves. They're usually roundish to elongated. They're individual. They don't really coalesce as what we see with some other lesions, and they have that raised bump on them and that irregular shape. They're very typical of tar spot. This is what we often will see early on in the season. So over the next 2 weeks or so, I was out scouting my plots out in the Rodney area, as well as on the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. And I didn't see any yesterday, but I would expect over the next couple of weeks to start seeing these tar spot symptoms on the lower leaves, so the bottom 2, 3, 4 leaves on the plant. Later on in the season, we often start seeing what we call the fisheye lesion, and this one is very similar. You have that stroma, that tar spot lesion, but now you start getting a tanned circle around it, and it looks like a fish eye or a frog eye or so, and this occurs later on in the season, and we may see that depending on different hybrids. So when it comes to tar spot, two different phases, two different symptoms and appearances that we can see. What have we learned? What have we all learned about tar spot, both here in Ontario as well as the U.S. since 2025? The first thing is that, hey, every year is different, right? You got to think of that disease triangle. Weather's been crazy this spring. Weather plays an important factor when we talk about the disease triangle, and particularly the impact on various different diseases. And tar spot is not any different. The one thing that we have seen, though, is that in Ontario, it is been very consistent, particularly in the southwestern part of Ontario over the 4 years, 21 to 24, that we've had it in the field. It's been very consistent for us. Will 2025 be that again? We don't know, but we will be dealing with tar spot for sure. Scouting. So I mentioned over the next couple of weeks to start scouting. Scouting is critically important. Finding out whether tar spot is in your fields, but also being aware of tar spot movement, both locally, regional, as well as into Ontario, as well as what's going on in the US. And we'll talk about how to do that and how some of the tools that are available to us too. Corteva Pioneer provides excellent genetics out there, not only for corn, but other crops as well. Host resistance is critically important. Now, when it comes to host resistance, we do have limitations right now. We do not have anything that we would call immune or totally resistant to tar spot. So what we're talking about is what we call partial resistance. So depending on environmental conditions and disease pressure, you'll see hybrids vary in their responses. We see that right now with stripe rust and some of the different varieties that had been wheat varieties that had shown moderate tolerance under heavier pressure don't show that. So host resistance is critically important, and a lot of work both with Corteva, other companies, as well as a lot of work we're doing with Agriculture, Food Canada, USDA, and colleagues in the US. One thing we do know is fungicides will work for tar spot. But again, there are certain limitations, and those limitations are in terms of what products are available, but also the timing is critical. We talk about finding tar spots, say, over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Is that an opportunity to spray? We don't see those early applications being beneficial, and we'll talk more about that. And the same thing, if the disease progresses to the point that it's causing significant impact on yield, and that by that point you're too late. So timing is critically important, and that ties back into scouting, being aware of what's going on in your fields, what the risks are in your field, but also what's going on elsewhere. And then that return on investment. We know that quite clearly in 2021, that first year that fungicides worked. The timings that we had in terms of our silking, our one timing and one application worked very well. Now we're starting to see our, do 2 apps work and have that return on investment as well. Again, those will depend on specific conditions as well as disease pressure and other things like that. One thing we have learned, by the end of the season, we pretty well have tar spot for those areas that have tar spots. So those days where we'll have 100% clean corn is probably not going to be seen again for us in the Southwest. But again, late infection we've seen has very minimal or any impact on yield and that as well. So keep that in mind. Stewardship in terms of the fungicides, and that we have to keep in mind. We have a whole bunch of new tools coming out, from the maps, from scouting tools, forecasting tools. All of those things are critically important, but really one of the key things is, as we continue to move, we're learning. And so keep asking those questions. This is a new disease. As I said, 2020 was when we found it in Canada and Southwestern Ontario. So every year we're learning new things, and so keep asking those questions. As I mentioned, tar spot has those two different symptoms that we will see out there in terms of both the stromas. And here, once you start getting up to 20, 25% or more leaf area covered with the tar spot stroma or tar spot lesions, then you start seeing the plant going chlorotic yellow, necrosis, and a quick shutdown of those leaves. And this is where the impact on yield is, as you lose that photosynthetic ability of that plant. That frog eye, the other thing that we see is that it will also be found on the ears themselves and the husks. This, although it does infect the husks in the ear there, it is not seed transmitted. That is critically important, especially for companies, seed producers like Corteva and Pioneer. We do not see seed transmission. And we've done a lot of work with Purdue and our US colleagues over the past 4 years collecting cobs and kernels from infected fields, and we've not seen that seed transmission. So that is a good thing to do. I know over the next couple of weeks, this first one here in terms of insect frass, pollen, aphids, all that, John and I are going to get a whole bunch of these images. Some are going to be good, some are not going to be good. So please, if you're going to send us pictures, send really good ones. And that, so again, when it comes to tar spot and insect frass, pollen, other things that are on the leaves could resemble tar spot, it's pretty simple. Get your finger out, wet it, rub on it, and if it comes off, it's not tar spot. If it stays on and feels almost like sandpaper, it potentially could be tar spot. Flip that the leaf over, and with tar spot, you'll see that it'll progress from the top to the bottom of the leaf. But this is by far about 90-95% of the images that come in that aren't tar spot are usually insect, frass, pollen, and that, right, John? Get those a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. There's it's easy to misdiagnose if you're not taking the time to basically touch and feel it, right? So
And then also as we go in, we see the saprophytic fungi, particularly later on in the year, or when the plants start to senesce, you often get mold or fungal colonization that is black. Very similar to tar spot, but again, instead of having that bump appearance to it, that stroma, these are pretty well flat. Sometimes you might see some mold associated with it, but they'll be flat appearance to it. Tar spot is our topic today, but hey, remember, northern corn leaf blight continues to be an issue, and we've started to see that more and more over the past couple of years. Again, and with my experience over my 4 years or so here with the ministry, is that with northern corn leaf blight, we go through cycles, and we end up seeing those cycles every 7 to 10 years. And I think we're starting to get into a new cycle as we start seeing new races of northern corn leaf blight develop that can bypass some of those effective genes that the companies have incorporated into it. Gray leaf spot is one that is around. Haven't seen as much gray leaf spot as we used to see. A lot of good resistance genes have been incorporated into gray leaf spot again, but it's something to keep in mind, more of a mid-US one. But again, as we get maybe warmer and longer conditions, we may see more a change to gray leaf spot re-emerging here as well.
I think Albert,
yes, sir.
Albert, the one point I would make in discussing those other diseases is, I mean, tar spot is an intimidating disease, and everybody's going to see some of the impact later with some of Albert's yield information that he's going to be able to share. But when you're going and selecting hybrids to grow on your farm, obviously, tar spot can't be the only thing you're considering when you're selecting hybrids. These other diseases are still important factors in growing corn, along with all the other agronomic factors that you need to consider for your specific growing environment. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to just focus on tar spot, but as you'll see later, it definitely has the potential to hurt yield.
Yeah, and that's a great point, John, in that when you have your discussions with your seed provider or your Pioneer dealer, kitchen table discussions, and assessing hybrids or both within season as well as planning for 2026 and beyond, have those discussions, get those hybrids that meet your needs, right? Your farm needs, and every field's going to be different. And tar spot is now one of those check marks that you have to deal with. But is it the primary one? There's a whole bunch of other considerations and factors in there. If you're a dairy farmer or so, standability, silage production, etc., is critically important. All of those things, standability, etc. So tar spot is now one of those check marks, but there's so many other things to consider when having those discussions, and they all start with talking with your seed provider as well. This is another one, common rust, that we have, and we had a whole bunch of samples come in late last year, particularly into Eastern Ontario and other areas. Here's common rust. Normally we'll see those brown spores or yellow, lighter colored spores on those. Later on in the season, what we see is what we call the teleospore stage, where these are mature rust lesions, and you start seeing some of those black spores produced. Looks very much like tar spot, but it's not. But again, you can rub those off and that. So keep that in mind, particularly later on in the season and those. So those are some of the common lookalikes for tar spot and that. And as we mentioned, tar spot was introduced or first found in the Midwest into Indiana, Illinois, and that in 2015, and then has continued to expand across the Midwest and into Ontario into 2020 and that. And we've continued to see that movement both east and west, north and south, and that continues to move every year. And you can see that development across much of the Corn Belt and into Ontario. And most recently in 2024, we started seeing our traditional southwestern Ontario tar spot, particularly along the north shore of Lake Erie. Again, the talk about environment, the disease triangle, having the Great Lakes and that consistent humidity is very ideal for diseases such as tar spot and that. But in 2024, we started seeing that jump over onto the other side of Toronto and that. And so we saw that movement late in the season. So overall impact was low, but now that we've seen the disease there, it will overwinter based on the experience that we've seen both in southwestern Ontario and through the US. It will most likely overwinter. We'll have an idea pretty quickly this year. And then as we move into Quebec this past year, so it's continued to expand eastward, both in Ontario, as well as if you look into New York, as well, Pennsylvania, and then into other parts of the northeastern United States. We're starting to see tar spot move there, which is not unexpected as well. And so one thing that we will note is that late in February, so we had some samples that were collected late October in the Winchester area, so it's far east Kempville area, and those came back as positive. There were only a few lesions, but again, we do have another infection in that far east portion of Ontario, which butts up to where we've seen it in Quebec, so not unexpected. So in 2025, these new areas, again, I would strongly encourage all growers, all retailers, pioneer dealers, agronomists, etc., to be out there scouting and following what's occurring locally. But we also have, as this map here, this corn IPM pipe, this cropprotectionnetwork.org website that we're part of has maps for real-time maps for tar spot as well as northern corn leaf blight, a number of different diseases, stripe rust, and that. So this is a great resource for tracking what's going on locally, but also seeing what's going on elsewhere. And talking about elsewhere and what we're seeing right now in 2026, this is the map I pulled up from this morning from the cropprotectionnetwork.org website. And you can see we've had tar spot in Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, now into Missouri and Nebraska for a couple of weeks now, and we're starting to add more and more counties. What does that mean? That just means that we have to be out there scouting. It doesn't, there's no indication of need for spraying on these. The one early comment from Darcy Talenko, my colleague at Purdue, was it was found similar time levels, maybe a little lower than what we saw in 2024. But again, things are starting to change now with weather conditions and that. But again, tar spot, this is normal. This is what we've been seeing. And so not unexpected to see it. And as I said, for us, the next couple of weeks are going to be critically important and I wouldn't be surprised to find tar spot in the Southwest as well.
Can I stop you, Albert, for a second?
Yes, sir.
I want to bring up one of the questions that just came in, because it talks about this scouting and the fact that with the stripe rust that's in the wheat this year, will that start appearing in corn and maybe leading growers to believe that they have tar spot when it's rust? So when they are scouting, what are we looking for there?
Yeah, so in terms of the question there, in terms of stripe rust in wheat this year, in corn. So remember, these pathogens are pretty well, many of them are obligate, right? And when it comes to the rust in particular, as well as tar spot has a very limited host range, and very limited is that it's corn. Those tar spot lesions or symptoms you see in your maple or ornamental plants, different organism in terms of that. Same symptoms and that, but they don't cross-infect. The same thing with stripe rust. Stripe rust in wheat will not infect corn. We will get rust in corn. That usually occurs later in the season as well. So again, as the question there is very important, and it's critically important to be out there scouting, either yourself, have your Pioneer dealer, have a crop consultant help you with that. Be aware of what's going on, and more importantly, what's happening. Is it changing? Are symptoms increasing, decreasing, and all that based on environmental conditions as well? And so the other question from Arlen here in terms of fungicide applications and measures outside of those of the hotspots and that we'll discuss those a bit later, and that particularly around when it comes to those early late apps, what your risks are in that as well. So in terms of Grace's question too, when it comes to late planted corn versus early late, a lot of that falls into the environmental conditions, the hybrids, and all that, and we'll discuss that as we move along. So Andrew, remind us as we go through there as well. And so when we talk about our risk for Ontario into Quebec, even the Maritimes, and that a lot of it will depend on what we see locally. So concentrating a lot of getting out there and scouting and finding out what's in those fields, what our risks are locally as well. But you saw, and the gray areas here are the confirmed tar spot locations over the past since 2015 in the US as well as into Canada and that. And what we saw in 2021, where we had very little or low overwintering, very extreme Southwest, our 2021 tar spot was considerably worse than I would have expected, not because of what was occurring in Ontario or what was established in Ontario in 2021. It was because of what was going on in the US. That's why we track what's going on in terms of US confirmations, but also in terms of spore production and what's going on the plants in terms of symptoms and damage and how rapidly the disease is building. Because if it starts off early in the US, you're going to start seeing a lot of spore production. Those spore productions, as we see with these storm fronts, move those spores not only into the Midwest, but into southwestern Ontario and into eastern Ontario, Quebec. So now for us in the Southwest, we get our local, but also that potential input from the Midwest in terms of spores. As we start moving to, say, eastern Ontario, you also will get some of the US stuff, but you'll start looking at what's going on in southwestern Ontario, because again, those storm fronts and moving those spores and that. And then when we start looking at both outside of Ontario, you start looking at Quebec, the Maritimes, you've also got another frontier where as you start seeing the Northeast become more infected with tar spot or spore production being there, you've got another avenue for moving those spores. And the question about stripe rust and wheat rust in general, those are the pathways that stripe rust and other airborne pathogens move. So these air movement patterns are very typical and an easy taxi ride or Uber ride for these pathogens into Ontario, Quebec, and into the Maritimes.
I think, well, Albert, this answers the question that just came in a bit ago from Bernie, inquiring about Eastern Ontario and Quebec, and so yes, Bernie, it the inoculum can come in via those storm fronts.
Yeah. And so also the question there in terms of received over 100 millimeters of rain in one day, those heavy downpours of rain, if you think about them, they are good in terms of bringing moisture, etc. But they actually clear the rain moves and clears all the spores in that out as well, right? So think about that. So it starts anew. What are really and we saw that with stripe rust this year, is that when you have those slow storm fronts that keep doing that circular stalled pattern that have some moisture to them, and those cloudy conditions, think of those favorable dawn mycotoxin conditions, white mold conditions, all of those conditions there are very conducive to tar spot as well. And that, so rain is important, but we'll talk about relative humidity, and that is more important as well. And that falls into this whole disease triangle side of things. So, Bernie, out in Eastern Ontario, Quebec, the Southwest, we have residue that is infected with tar spot. It overwinters. We produce the tar spot will produce those spores, those ascospores early on. At this point right now, those spores are around, and they will move on to the developing or planted corn from this year. And again, that timing from movement from that residue to the new crop fluctuates depending on environmental conditions, planting dates, etc. And what you'll start seeing under moderate temperatures, good leaf wetness or extended leaf wetness periods, you'll start seeing that infection occurring. And with tar spot, if you start seeing the infection from the bottom up, that's an indication that that inoculum, that risk is from within the field. Later on in the season, Bernie and others may have seen that the tar spot, and this is what we saw in 2020, and we continue to see that, where the top portion from the ear leaf or from the ear above is infected. That usually indicates that those spores have come in, right? That air movement into that field. And this is where tar spot really drives it, is that once those symptoms start to occur, that initial infection occurs, we can start seeing the going from new stroma, new lesions, new tar spot lesions occurring every, we say here every 2 to 3 weeks. It can be as quickly as a week to 3 weeks. And a lot of that depends on daily temperatures, so moderate to high temp. I wouldn't say high temperatures, this high relative humidity of 75% or greater. It's those long dew periods or foggy days that really drive it. And it's this leaf wetness, that 7 hours of leaf wetness at night, those keeping those leaves wet, very moist, very favorable for that infection, really drives the disease. One thing that we saw this year is those conditions that we were cool, we were wet, we had humidity, etc., very favorable for tar spot. We were dry for a while, and we continue to be a bit dry. I'm curious to see if that will slow down or limit the early infection, so we'll see that coming. But then with tar spot, it's the cycling, and we see that with the stripe rust and wheat, and that the quicker you have that cycling from stroma to stroma. As I said, it can be from 1 week to 3 weeks. It's this quickness that really drives the impact. And those spores are in the air usually about, a week to 3 weeks after the stroma production. So again, spores are not usually at limit. It's those prolonged wet, cool periods and those multiple disease cycles that we see with tar spot, as well as what we've seen with stripe rust this year. And that's where we see that drastic, quick dry down and premature senescing of the plants. And that can occur really quickly as well. In terms of Gabrielle's question about crop rotation and that, so crop rotation, residue management, all of those are critically important when it comes to disease management. This is some of the work early on that was done with my U.S. colleagues before we had tar spot in Ontario. And basically they were looking at residue, resistance levels, and that to see what the impact was. Crop rotation, first of all, since it is, crop rotation is always one of the first tools we use for managing diseases. But when we talk about these aerial-borne diseases, then that, and particularly when it's in a region, as we see with tar spot now, same thing with gibberella, ear rot, northern corn leaf blight, and that, it's a regional impact, and these are airborne spores. So rotating from corn to soybeans to wheat and all that can help us reduce some of our in-field risk. It doesn't mean that we won't see tar spot there because of that movement into those fields. First of all, in terms of residue management, they were looking at high residue versus low residue fields and looking at tar spot severity. I'm not sure if my mouse is showing up or not on this, but you can see on the high level on here in terms of tar spot severity, and this not what I would, for us, we see 20-25% or more, but you can see here the trend is that higher residue levels will give you a little higher risk than low, but we don't see removing all that residue doesn't reduce the risk because, again, that airborne movement, it's a numbers game when it comes to tar spot. Where we do see a big bang, management tool, again, is that, as John had mentioned earlier about, the tolerance, right? Those hybrids and that as well. And so here we can see susceptible versus resistance. We've seen that within our trials in Ontario. We have Pioneer hybrids as well as others. We had on general 100 hybrids that we've been evaluating, and we can see differences definitely in terms of hybrids in that. So again, that tolerance, partial resistance we have is a tool that is effective. Residue, crop rotation, not as much. The other thing is, in the question about late planted corn, early planted corn, when we start seeing tar spot, primarily it's a post-tassel grain fill period disease where we see it really wrapping up. Again, it's that snowballing effect. So think about the beginning parts of the snowball to later, and that's where we start seeing tar spot, usually from milk and above. And so incorporating, residue management with, say, tolerant hybrids are a much more effective management tool as well in combination as well. So that residue effect, that hybrid resistance. So residue effect is minimal in this, so in terms of residue management, but hybrid resistance is a larger effect in terms of managing tar spot than residue. Question around what we've seen over the past few years. And again, this is just showing the curve over time for both the susceptible and a tolerant hybrid. As I said, we don't have anything that's totally resistant. So the goal here is to reduce that rate of that curve increasing, or the amount of tar spot we see in that field, to reduce our risk, basically to keep the plant healthy and green long enough to maximize yield, maximize grain fill as well. What have we seen in Ontario? Since 2021 was the first overwintering, that first week of July 4th, 2022, July 6th, a week later in 2023, and last year, July 5th. So again, those first 2 weeks are when we traditionally have seen tar spot, and as I said, we will be out there scouting and that. So again, that just means it's there, it's overwintered, it starts its potential will depend on what the environmental conditions, the hybrid, and the risk in the fields as well. This is from my location in Rodney from last year. This is using the Tar Spotter app. This Tar Spotter app now has been incorporated into the crop protection network.org forecast tools, and we'll talk about that. But basically what you're looking at here on the left is the tar spot risk. The higher the bar, the greater the risk. On the bottom, we look at the calendar dates and that, and you can see that period into June into July, very favorable for tar spot. Again, cooler temperatures, relative humidity, moisture, all those conditions. Again, looking at it for this year, same conditions. We are running basically from 90 to 100%, very similar to what we saw last year with this year compared to last year and other years. So again, the early part, we're always going to have those favorable conditions early, so that will drive disease. Last year, we did see a decrease during tasseling and silking period because it was hot and dry in the Southwest, and that we saw the risk decrease a bit there. But then later on, as we moved into August, and that we started seeing that increase risk increase. That's why we had less dawn than we expected, was that hot, dry conditions were less. And so it's important to consider. We see July 4th, those early part of July is when tar spot starts to develop. When we start seeing the disease on the 5th, like we did last year, there was a lot of activity going on earlier. Basically, that residue that's infected, the tar spot has to produce those ascospores, land on a corn plant, and then show symptoms. And we call that incubation period, right? So you go from the residue to those first symptoms. That usually takes about 4 to 6 weeks. And that's where, depending on your planting date, and that will determine when you see it. So earlier planted corn, those late April, beginning of May are falling into that 6-week window right now as well. And then as we move farther on, those cycles start to begin, and that's what we call the latent period. So now those initial lesions that occurred are now starting to produce spores that will infect, and that'll start that disease cycle every 1 to 3 weeks. And that's where we start seeing that rapid buildup later on through. And this usually ties into the tassel to silken period. And so our experience in Ontario is that by the time we start looking at fungicide applications, say for gibberella ear rot during that our reproduction silken period, there's some tar spot, but it's below the ear at that point. And normally when we apply our fungicides for our trials, we might have 1 to 2 tar spot lesions on that ear leaf. There's not a lot below that. It's probably around 5% on that. It's what happens post-tasseling where we start seeing those rapid increases. And as was mentioned in one of the comments there, that late season infection that we will see. And that's when we start seeing that sudden senescence in that. So keep that in mind. You may see it that early part or early July. When you see that, think 6 weeks ago, what were the conditions? That's when we start seeing this disease cycle go on. I mentioned this Tar Spotter app, and that if you go to the cropprotectionnetwork.org, under there'll be under tools, there's a new crop disease forecasting tools there, not only for tar spot and corn and wheat, and that we've also got a number of other vegetable models under there as well. So this is something that's new, again, that is available, and it's nice because it's all under one window now, and you can put in your location. It'll tell you over time what your risk was and what your risk will be. So encourage everybody to use that and look at it. And I was just looking at two of my locations, our Rodney location and Ridgetown location, and incorporating those and looking at the risk over this past year, from last week and prior to that, and you can see that steady buildup of both for tar spot, gray leaf spot, both for Rodney and Ridgetown. And I apologize, I didn't pull it off for this morning. But as we move into, as I said, into June and earlier, we were basically in that 95 to 100%. So similar to what we've seen before. All right, so the risk is there as well. And so again, that go under tools, crop disease forecasting, and both tar spot and other tools available to us. Oops, let me go back. This one should be hidden here. But in this image here, you'll excuse me for putting this one in here. Didn't work here, but if you look at a susceptible versus a moderately resistant hybrid, you'll notice that on a susceptible hybrid, the stroma, the tar spot will appear very typical, very happy. Here on the hybrid, with good tolerance, what you'll start seeing is the tar spot will still be there, but there's some various obvious symptoms or appearance differences as well. The stroma are often much smaller, as you can see. They also usually have a yellow border around them. That's a hypersensitive response. That's basically the genetics, the hybrid, recognizing that it's trying to be invaded and it's trying to kill off cells or limit the further infection in that. And so selecting hybrids, as we said, is one of the effective tools that we can use for managing tar spot for a number of reasons. Is that although we don't have total resistance, we do have partial resistance. So by using a moderately resistant hybrid, you're able to reduce the rate of infection, that curve as it increases. The lesions themselves are smaller. They take longer to develop, which means that they produce also less spores. And so that cycling can decrease. So that snowball becomes smaller and not as rapid. Having said that, of course, you're still going to see some tar spot on there and manage it as well. And so the goal here is that these are the stroma that you're seeing. These are the spores that are being produced, and there's millions and millions of spores. So it's a numbers game when we come to managing tar spot. On the hybrid side, and John will jump in as well on this. There's been a lot of efforts both for the companies such as Pioneer, the private as well as public horn breeding programs, looking at tolerance and resistance to tar spot. This is our evaluations from last year's hybrid trial, and what we see here is that of those 100 hybrids, the majority are what we would call fairly susceptible. And this was from mid-August through to that September 10th period. That's when we normally will see that rapid increase, and when growers will see going from green tissue to very senescent or quick dry down or shutdown of those plants usually occurs during that late August into mid-September, late September period. And that's when we see the impact on yield critically important. But we do have some hybrids that are much more tolerant here. And so there is some progress there. We're doing a bunch of evaluations with Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, corn program in Ottawa, bringing in some resistant genes from Mexico, where tar spot has been originated and had been since 1909 in North America, and trying to incorporate those into some high yielding germplasm that could be available to help with that. And again, Corteva, other companies, USDA, we're looking at that, and there's a lot of progress going on, and you'll see an increase in those as well. So John, what are you seeing on your hybrids and that as well?
Yeah, so got a couple of slides here that I think nicely demonstrate kind of what you might expect as a producer in regards to response from fungicide on products with different genetic tolerances. And right now on the slide, you'll see a product on the, or the product has a score of 4. So we use a 1 to 9 scale, 9 being completely resistant, 1 being quite bad. So this is a product with a score of 4, so below average. And when we apply a fungicide, this is from a trial not far from London. We've done this trial now for a couple of years, and we plan out various hybrids with different scores and apply a fungicide at tassel. And you can visually see the influence of the fungicide on that 4-score hybrid. So on the left-hand side, and these photos were taken on September the 26th, and it demonstrates, the kind of protection you might expect to see on that product. Now, if you go to the next, if you go ahead one, now here's a product. We have one product in our lineup, 04922. That is the only product we currently have with a score of 8. We're pretty happy to have something with that strong of a tolerance to it. But I think, again, visually speaking, you can see the difference between sprayed and unsprayed is quite a bit less. Now, to translate that into yield at the end of the season, obviously there's other factors involved. So we are seeing even on this product with a score of 8 for tar spot, we are still seeing under high pressure a really nice response in terms of yield. But if I had a field that it was difficult to get into to spray, or I couldn't get to it in a timely manner, this product is going to handle that pressure much better than a lower scoring product.
Mm-hmm. In my experience from all our trials that we've done, in terms of both, we usually have a tolerant, or what we rate as a tolerant hybrid that would be similar to this, versus a susceptible hybrid. We generally will see maybe a 30 to 50% difference in terms of yield. So if we're looking at a 30 to 40% on that more susceptible hybrid, and with no fungicides or so, we might see that 15 to 20 bushel, right, under our pressure and that. So again, we have, germplasm. Hybrid tolerance is critically important. It provides you with some level of protection, but not all of it, as we can see here, because there's still that impact. The other side, John, too, is that those high yielding susceptible hybrids that we see, again, those discussions, right? What fits the farm, what fits your needs too. There's also a place there as well, but critically important, it's having those discussions, right? Being aware of, are you a tolerant versus susceptible hybrid, and planning your management according to that as well.
Yeah, the other thing that I'll mention, because I know we have a lot of growers from Eastern Ontario and into Quebec, the opportunity to score and rate our products on the earlier maturing germplasm was obviously limited earlier, and you could see that from the maps that Albert shared earlier, that we didn't have the opportunity to necessarily screen that material. As the disease spreads, we are getting that opportunity. So we are starting to generate the database on that, and we're starting to have some scores on some of the earlier materials. So talk to your sales rep about what might be available in terms of scores, and as you plan ahead for your 2026 season, or with what you have in the field currently.
Yeah, in my experience, we've been evaluating everything from those early 80, 85-day corn up to 110 or more, right? And so, we think about early versus late maturing hybrids. Early on, there was a lot of discussion around maturity made the big difference. You can have low maturity, high maturity hybrids, and you can have a variance between more tolerant and highly susceptible as well. So again, having to know what the characteristics are each of those hybrids is critically important to have those discussions as well. And so, you can see clearly from these pictures, and you saw mine in the past as well, that, fungicide application, both for tolerant hybrids and susceptible hybrids pay. And, if we talk to growers in the Southwest and that, on average, we're seeing 20 to 40 bushel response to fungicides pretty easily. And that has been one of the critically important learnings, and we learned that pretty quickly in 2021, is that we have some hybrids that are tolerant. We have many that are more susceptible. Tar spot overwintered, but we also knew that the tools we were using to manage, say, northern corn leaf blight, eye spot or common rust or gray leaf spot, all of those, we have many different products that were already in place and many growers had familiarity with, that were very effective against tar spot. And we see products, the Veltimas, the Veltima DLXs, the Deleros, Delero Completes, the Miravis Neos. Those have been the most consistent products that we have available to us, and work very well against many of the other diseases, but also provide some protection against tar spot as well. Acapella is also registered for tar spot. Now that one is under more suppression. The other three are control, and Miravis label change this year is now also got a control label for it as well. So we have various different options that work very well for tar spot. And again, the responses the return on investment has been there. And again, it all depends on your level of tar spot, your experience with tar spot, what we've seen in the past in those areas. As I said, northern portion of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, that North Shore, southwestern Ontario. Now we're starting to see it basically from Toronto over to Windsor is our hotspot, but now we're starting to see it move in to those other areas and so this is some my good friend Mike Miller and Rodney, who allows me to do trials on his farm, tolerates me, sorry, and we learn a lot. And this is just some of his observations and some of his what he saw with tar spot. And here's a great example. Here is 7 different fields, all treated with a fungicide. You can see the responses, right? And this is very usually what we'll see, anywhere from a 14 to 70 bushel increase, right? And so we tested over 20 different fungicides. They all respond to tar spot, and they all manage tar spot effectively, some more so than others, depending on pressure and all that. But we can see a very consistent fungicide response when it comes to tar spot. And you can see that range. So again, where we might have a more tolerant hybrid versus a more susceptible hybrid, those yield responses may be different. And again, these are looking at 20 other fields that Mike had in terms of the yields, responses, and that. But again, depending, regardless of the brand or so, we can see various hybrids that are more tolerant, more susceptible. But again, the general trend is that we have tools that are available to us to manage tar spot. We have the fungicides. We have our products that are available and hybrids there as well. But it's also critically important, the timing side there as well. So we can manage tar spot, but again, it's that awareness, being knowing what your local risks are and what's going on is critically important. And this is just
Can
some
I
of
stop
our.
you for a second, Albert?
Yes.
Because I want to, if you go back to that slide, I think it ties in with kind of 2 questions. Because Leon had the question about what's the impact on fungicide application on harvested grain moisture versus no fungicide application. But I actually would like you to maybe go one step further in that. That's on the grain moisture. for those that are pulling it off that way. I see a few in there that are also going to be chopping it as silage. Do we know what the impact is on digestibility between, treated and untreated?
Yeah, so again, there's a bunch of work and done out of Wisconsin, and we're going to be doing some. Dave Hooker and I are hoping to do some silage work here as well. So two things there. We usually see about a half to a percentage different in terms of grain moisture, very typical of what we see with our fungicide responses there. On the silage side, critically important there is that quick shutdown, right, of tar spot. That senescence really has a drastic impact on digestibility, fiber, forage quality or silage quality there as well. So again, managing that tar spot for dairy, for silage is critically important. And there is where maybe some of those discussions around 1 app versus 2 apps are important, because you have some harvest. You can harvest depending on you have flexibility in harvest date there with silage that we may not see with grain corn as well.
Yeah.
And so it's critically important. And the same thing goes when we talk about gibberella ear rot and fungicides and silage, and that we can find two components for gib into silage is both the ear and the stalks. So that quality there too. But yes, it has a drastic impact on silage quality as well.
I think I want to reiterate the healthy plants at the end of the season are not a bad thing. And until you have an opportunity to see what tar spot can do to a crop when it's unprotected, it looks like a frost went through the field when it's heavy, right? So if you're filling a bunk on the silage side of things, that plant health is critical to putting in good feed for your animals. And the moisture, the potential for moisture differences in the grain on fungicide treated, it doesn't take a lot of bushels of grain to compensate for the cost of that drying. So what we've seen is significant enough yield response. And again, that depends on your pressure, of course, but under the pressure that we've seen, very rarely does that increase in grain moisture end up offsetting the benefits to the yield side of the equation.
Then maybe what we can do is also tackle the question that came in first when we were talking about fungicide, and that was, what control measures would you recommend in some of those fringe areas? We've got, I think the ones that have dealt with it, have a little bit better understanding. They know what the benefits are, because, when it is as bad as it can be. Those fringe areas that maybe don't have as much heavy pressure, we're not exactly sure what the pressure is going to be, in 2025. Does that 2 fungicide pass pay? Is it worth spraying everything? Just where are your recommendations in terms of those fringe areas or areas that haven't seen it? It's been close, but maybe not too bad.
Yeah, so over our research with the U.S. colleagues, and that consistent has been a one-time fungicide application, critically important during that R1 silking timeframe. Has been the most consistent, the most best in terms of return on investment, and we continue to see that. For when we talk about the various different fungicides under those high pressure environments, we are seeing, and this is 2022, which was one where out of the 4 previous 2022 lower tar spot overall impact, the other 3 have been quite would be very consistent, high yield, loss potential with tar spot. But again, the DLX, the DLX, the Lero Complete, the Miravis Neo, those are usually how they shake out when under high pressure. Fringe areas, get a fungicide on there. I'm not too about what fungicide and that. If you're seeing tar spot, it is increasing, and you've got a highly susceptible hybrid. And you're also, don't forget, gibberella, and I have a slide later on in there, is that, for many growers, tar spot is important. Gibberella is something else that we have to manage. And these high fungicides also help us with those other diseases and gib as well. And so for those new areas that are starting to see tar spot, be aware, be out there scouting, look at what's going on in the Southwest, what's going on in the Midwest US, see what is coming in terms of potential spores in that, because that's what was the one thing in 2021 that I was totally surprised in. I did not expect us to have much tar spot other than those pockets, but we had much more and across a larger geographical area. Why? Because of that movement of those spores from the US. So that's something to keep in mind. And in terms of that timing side of things, again, this is just some of our work from 2023, and we have other data looking at this versus, this is just looking at tar spot on its own. Severity wise, we can see the fungicides can reduce tar spot, that silking time frame, R3, double apps, and then that untreated hybrid number 2 are more tolerant hybrids. So again, you can see here's that, we're half the tar spot on that more tolerant hybrid, right? And that's where we usually will see, talking about that yield protection with those more tolerant hybrids. We see less disease on there and that. But again, that critically important time frame is this R1 has been our most consistent, and that's also our tar spot timing as well. And this is from last year. So the other thing about the grain moisture is we also think about kernel weight, right? And so this is fungicide application. So the way it looked, untreated check on the left here. So on the side here, you'll see our untreated, non-treated controls are Veltima Deluxe, Delero Complete, Miravis, and then Zolera is another one we looked at. And you'll see anywhere from 10 to 20% reduction in tar spot compared to our check here. We can see the yields too for, like the Veltima DLX here, we're almost at 50 bushels, right? So we see those consistent 40. So those 20 to 40 bushel responses very consistently. And this goes back to, even the silage question, the impact on grain quality, etc. We see that also in terms of kernel weight in that we can see a big impact increase in terms of that yield component with these fungicide applications as well. So with a fungicide, managing a fungicide, not only yield, but there is many different quality aspects as well. But when it comes to this whole discussion around the timing side of things, what I really would want, especially with reduced corn prices and that silking time frame has been the most consistent for our work as well as the US, and it's our common recommendation across the Corn Belt and on into Ontario as well, is that silking time frame catches all the benefits we can get from that fungicide application. It can help us with our northern corn leaf blight, our gibberella ear rot risks, etc. as well. Is that window more open? Sure. And so areas that aren't looking at, say, gibberella ear rot and that, could you go from that V12 to that R3 milk stage? Sure, we can see that benefit, but it's again reducing your overall risk and getting that return on investment. And when that hiccup we have here that's different, say, in much of the US, is this Dawn gibberella ear rot, right? We saw 2018, the impact there. And so that R1 timing is almost a necessity for much of Ontario, much of where we have that risk for gibberella ear rot, because with tar spot, we can lose substantial yield for sure, 20, 40 bushels. Some of our test fungicides, we're getting 80 bushels or more response. And so fungicides work, we can get those responses. But with gibberella ear rot, what we saw in 2018 is if you can't market your corn, that has a drastic impact on your return on investment. right? So keep that in mind on that as well. The
So
other
then I think,
side,
Albert, that
yep,
that maybe answers. Jake had a question that with proper scouting, can you delay the first application if the pressure isn't too high to reduce the need for a second application? It sounds like you can, but you may change the risk of some of the other stuff like gibberella.
right. And so, but I wouldn't go past that R3, that milk stage and beyond, because then again, that don't forget the disease is already there. It's 6 weeks or a few weeks earlier than that. And so these fungicides, and this is why you're starting to see more of them going to, when we 20, 30 years ago, we didn't use a lot of fungicides in corn. And if we did have products, they were usually single modes of action, one product in there. Now we're seeing 2 or 3 different AIs or active ingredients in there. Why? Because it has a bigger window on the fungus itself or on the pathogen. So it can, in fact, it can manage that spore germination. It can also manage once those spores germinate and the mycelium or that hyphae, the mold starts to grow and trying to infect those plants. Got a wider window of activity with those fungicides, and so hence why we're seeing those multiple modes of action there. And so that helps us. But once the disease tar spot started and it's inside the leaf, you're not gonna eliminate it. There is some limited post-infection activity, but it is not curative. And we've seen that with stripe rust this year in wheat, that there is a 5, 6, 7 day, 10-day window where you'll still see stripe rust lesions, those orange spores coming up. Why? Because it was already established in the plant and the fungicide can't get to it at that point. There's no activity. So remember, there are limits on those. So again, going too late will the infection has already started. The barn door is open, so you're going to see an impact there. So again, that 12 to R3 is a window, but again, that R1 silken one has been our most consistent and checks all our boxes so far. But every field is different. But again, gibberella throws a little curve for us.
Then
The
can I
others,
pass the
yeah,
next question to John on this?
sure.
Because Gord had a question just on, you mentioned the 094994922. That's the one that's got the rating of 8. Maybe you can kind of give a little insight, both from your experience and from, what you know is in the pipeline in terms of some of the shorter day hybrids. Are there ones that are likely coming with more tolerance, with those same resistant genes? What else might fit in some of those shorter day hybrids?
Mhm. Yeah, so I'm not a plant breeder, and I have friends that are plant breeders, but I would say that obviously the breeders are looking to incorporate whatever genes are available, and to say we completely understand the genes that are influencing tar spot, I think it's a little premature. I think breeders are working hard to understand that. They have a lot of tools available to them, and breeders do have a tendency to reach into the fuller season germplasm to pull beneficial yield potential, disease resistance or tolerance into the earlier germplasm. I can say this, Gord, that definitely the early breeders, the early germplasm breeders are looking to move that tolerance into that maturity group. But it's a real balancing act because, again, we're not just focusing on tar spot. We have a lot of other agronomics to consider for you in that part of the world: standability, roots and stalks, test weight, dry down, all of those things. So without having a breeder on the call to dig into the weeds on that would be my answer to that question.
In our work with Ag Canada in Ottawa, the breeding program there, they're concentrating on some of those earlier maturing corn hybrids as well on that and incorporating those in there. But there's a lot of activity across, and the shorter season is one of the a lot of activity going into those as well.
Tell the story on this slide.
So we talked
Albert,
about,
because this is important.
so the other side is, you can do everything right. You can pick the right hybrid, you can have the right fungicide, you can have the right timing for it. But again, with anything, if we don't do a good job with it and get the product where we need it at the right time, etc., the results are not going to be satisfactory, right? And tar spot is one of those diseases that really shows you whether you've done a good job or not. And this is a great example here. This is some images that Christine Brown, colleague, good friend of mine and colleague of mine with OMAFA, has provided us from last year, from her field as well. So this was aerial application, few things going on in terms of, we've got some trees, hydro wires, etc. So, there are some issues, and you can see where, the airplane in this particular case had to pull up, the aerial applicator had to pull up for the trees. And that's normal. We would see that. So you get less fungicide deposition there. The other thing is, when it comes to the swath width for many of these, for many of the aerial applicators and that fixed wings, we often see that swath curling outwards, and very sufficient deposition of the fungicide at that point. And you see, Jason DeVoe, my colleague as well, talks a lot about deposition and penetration and that. And so you can see here where we've got, basically, you can see where the swaths were a little too wide. And so the deposition, we had areas that had good fungicide coverage, other ones that still had adequate for normal pathogens, for instance, but with tar spot, insufficient amount of fungicide being delivered on that. And so again, you're going to see that when it comes to swath width, and that the aerial applicators are going to make that tighter to make sure that the full product is delivered there. But again, if we don't have the right tool, it doesn't matter if we're talking ground rig, aerial, drones, all of those things. If we don't do a good job of getting that product into the crop where we need to, you're not going to be happy with the results. You're not going to get the full value of that fungicide application and that product efficacy and that. So again, tar spot is it is a bugger, and it will tell us if we do a good job or not, for sure. And that ties us into this whole, what have we learned? What have we seen over the years? Is that when it comes to tar spot, environment really drives this. And so that leaf wetness is critically important. So, those foggy mornings, those conditions that are favorable for gibberella ear rot, those conditions that are favorable for white mold are also very favorable for tar spot. And you also have to understand your farm risk. The weather, we can't manage the weather, but we can manage our risks. So that field, that local history of tar spot, those hybrids, those susceptible versus tolerant hybrids can be there. And as John and I have mentioned, think about the other disease packets, other characteristics that are required on many of us, focus on those fields with the highest yield potential. Again, those are the ones that you'll see the biggest yield loss potential, but also the biggest gains potentially with fungicides. As I mentioned, we've tested 20 hybrids or more. All the fungicides can reduce tar spot compared to the non-treated controls. We do have some very good products. The Veltima DLX, as I mentioned, Delero Complete, Miravis Neo, right now that are registered. Those products are the three tar spot to go products out there. But we have to also remember that these fungicides, the ones that are most consistent, why have they been? Is that they have a mixed modes of action, 2 or 3-way fungicides continue to be most consistent. They reduce both the tar spot and provide that yield component. We also know that when it comes to that one fungicide application program, it's that silking time frame that has been the most consistent, regardless of gibberella and all of that, for the Midwest US and us as well. And so that's been our most consistent, that silking application, using the tools that are available, those maps, those apps, that cropprotectionnetwork.org is there. And then again, if we don't do a good job of getting that coverage, we're not going to get the full benefit of that as well.
I'll just add the photo of the aerial application might be might might suggest that aerial is not is not as good, and I I would strongly suggest that if you are battling tar spot, you want to take what you have access to. So we have plenty of acres in southwestern Ontario that are applied aerially, helicopter, or sprayer. And it's if you have high tar spot pressure, an application, regardless of technique, is pretty important to protect yield. Now, to Cam's question, yeah, drones currently are not capable of applying any of the fungicides that are currently registered on corn. We obviously, the industry wants to work towards that. There's a lot of research being done. Obviously, south of the border, drones are currently being used with fungicides, but in Canada, that would be a no-no, Cam. And so we're patiently waiting for those opportunities. And Albert can maybe speak a little bit more technically towards where we're at with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on now to support the decision by PMRA and that to allow drone fungicide applications, and that drone applications for other uses are available, but fungicides as of yet not. But I think we've got one herbicide on there now, so they're working towards it, and hopefully that'll be coming quite quickly. There is a lot of work, a lot of partnerships, and that between the the private companies and that, as well as government extension, et cetera, research to provide that information to do that. So I'm hoping it'll be coming quickly, but again, we don't know it. But it's John's point there, and again, and our point here again, whether it's a ground rig, that aerial, that drone, any of those things, the results will be only as good as how well it's done, right? So remember that. So regardless of the tool, if you don't do it right, you may not be happy with the results. And by no means were we saying that aerial is not as good as ground rig, etc. They're all effective. They just have to be done right.
Andrew, I don't know if we answered Grace's question from earlier on, and I realize we're stretching the length of this, but the question about did late planted corn, it seemed to be far less impacted by tar spot in 2024, and I know I had that question come up. Should we just plant our corn later, and that would allow us to avoid avoid infection or reduced infection of tar spot, and I don't believe that would be a wise agronomic practice. I do think it personally, and I've had a couple of discussions with breeders. I think the situation there is the fact that at younger stages or earlier stages of development, corn plants have more resources being utilized to fight things like disease. As corn gets closer and closer to maturity, it's focusing on filling the ear, and it takes resources away from some of that disease tolerance or disease fighting capability. We did see a lot of fields last year, all of a sudden, within a short period of time, basically shut down, and I think that's a nice indication of that explanation. But again, breeders are looking into it. They observed it in research plots as well.
One thing we did notice in 2021 with the amount of tar spot we had, Dave Hooker and I went through the Ontario Corn Performance Trials and looked at those and various different maturities and planting dates. for some of our other trials there, and we found that, and this is common with a lot of other diseases, and that the later planted crops, you're moving that window of grain fill as well as pollination and that into a more favorable environment too, right? Now, if we're thinking last year with the conditions in July that were hotter and drier, less favorable for gibberella, less favorable for tar spot in that, you move that 2 weeks later, and you're looking into that end of July, early August. That's when our rains start coming back, right? And we start seeing cooler temperatures. All of those conditions make it more favorable for a disease. So by planting later, you actually may be moving that critical grain fill period into a more favorable environment for disease development and infection as well.
One more question just came in from Fred. So ground rig sprays at 10 gallons because they get it all done, then might as well spray by air. So I think it probably is a volume
Yeah.
question too,
I like,
obviously.
I like that, Fred. That's good. So I mean, the recommendation for these fungicides through a ground rig is always going to be 20 gallons to the acre, and applicators are not crazy about pumping 20 gallons to the acre because it slows them down. But there are, and if you go to this Sprayers 101 website, there are some really great videos showing the difference between 10 gallons versus 20 gallons in terms of penetration. Uh, some of the new boom attachments that allow you to get nozzles down at the ear level have proven to provide some pretty significant yield benefits through the ability to protect against the diseases. So I think, yeah, I mean, if I didn't have the option to have a ground rig in my field and I was fighting tar spot, I'm going to have a helicopter or I'm going to have a plane, without a doubt. But higher volume, I think, does have some ability to get better coverage.
And yeah, and again, you can see, a lot of the work Dave Hooker and us, Jason and others we've been doing with the rodeos and things like that. That combination there is too in terms of the ground rigs where you have the over the top with some type of drop, right? So you get both of those critically important. And you can see with this Haggy um, rig here, those were just homemade nozzles, right? And very cheap. You can do those pretty effectively. But again, it comes down to making sure that it's done right and gets the product where you need to. And for us, those the ear leaf and below, but just the bottom part of the plant, by the time tar spot is developed and really rolling, you're not really gonna limit any further infection with getting that fungicide into there. It's maintaining the ear leaf and above is where we get that grain fill and that yield protection there as well. Any other questions?
Oh, a great thank you to Gord, because I think that is actually one of those where it really is one where you hear from, if you've experienced it, fine, you see some of those, what the challenges are. If you haven't experienced, you hear a lot of stories, and certainly it is one of those things where to be able to get some, information for whichever camp you happen to be in, just in how to manage it, or, likely the reality of how you're going to have to manage it in the next few years. Has been really helpful, guys, and certainly, John, you mentioned that idea that it almost looks like it got hit by frost. I think that really is one of those things. Having seen it, in this area, it really is something to watch how that impact can, work day by day. It really is, that quick sometimes once it does hit hard. Maybe there is an opportunity to just, ask another question or two if you do. But while we wait for those, any final thoughts, Albert and John, from you guys?
Well, Gord's comment there about scary and all that, when it comes to tar spot, and I try to always end this with it, it is a disease that we need to respect. Don't fear it. We have the tools, and we found that pretty quickly, right? And so it comes to awareness, knowing what's going on, and manage it accordingly as well. And that may be no management at all as well. So it is, again, treat it with respect. We don't have to fear it. We do have the tools, and our tools are going to get better over the next few years as well.
Yeah, and I would just say again, reiterate the fact that tar spot is definitely a significant disease that you do have to respect, but don't take your eye off of all the other agronomic factors and the characteristics of the hybrids that you need to be successful on your farm, because tar spot is one of the things that you need to manage if you're growing corn in our part of the world.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, it looks like we've answered all the questions that everyone's ever had about tar spot. So, gentlemen, only you two could do that. But in all seriousness, it really has been a great webinar, and certainly one that I feel, and I hope everybody else, feels that no, this is something, as you said, we can manage, we can tackle this, with the right product, with the right scouting, with the right, plan for this year and years going forward. So, John, Albert, thanks for joining us. Thanks for all of the information. And all of you, thanks for joining us on this webinar. Don't forget that if you ever do have more questions, you're not sure about, a specific field, a specific variety, any of those things, your Pioneer rep or your Pioneer area agronomist is definitely the place that you want to be asking, because they have all of this information and more, at their fingertips with lots of resources behind them. So definitely make sure that if you do have more questions, ask away. But John, Albert, and everyone else, thanks very much for joining our Tar Spot webinar this morning.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.